Do you live in Guatemala? Do you have family in Antigua, Escuintla, Zacatepeques, or any of the small farming towns scattered across the slopes below one of the most dangerous volcanoes in Central America? Because right now, Volcán de Fuego, the volcano of fire, is doing what it has done almost every single day for more than 2 decades. And this week, its ash is drifting directly over communities that know, better than almost anyone else on Earth, exactly what this mountain is capable of when it decides to stop behaving. Here's the part that surprises people who are only hearing about Fuego for the first time. This is not a new eruption starting up out of nowhere. Fuego has been continuously erupting since the year 2002, more than 2 decades of near-constant activity, making it one of the most active volcanoes in the entire Western Hemisphere. According to Guatemala's Instituto Nacional de Sismología, Vulcanología, Meteorología y Hidrología, the agency everyone in the region simply calls INSIVUMEH, the volcano is currently producing somewhere between 6 and 14 explosions every single hour, day and night, without pause. Each one sends a column of gas and ash climbing to somewhere between 4,200 and 4,800 meters above sea level, which puts the ash roughly a kilometer or more above the volcano's own summit, itself already towering at 3,763 meters. To put that constant activity in perspective, volcanologists who study Fuego's full eruptive record note that, going back to 1524, the volcano has been in some state of eruption during roughly 1 out of every 6 years on average across 5 centuries, and since 1900 specifically, that ratio has climbed to nearly 1 out of every 3 years. The current eruptive phase, running continuously since 2002, is not even the longest such stretch in the mountain's recorded history, but it is the one every resident alive today has grown up inside, and the one that has shaped how an entire generation of Guatemalan farmers, schoolchildren, and emergency planners understands what a normal week looks like at the foot of this volcano. But here's the problem. Those columns are not just drifting off harmlessly into open sky. According to the latest bulletins, the ash is being carried west and southwest, in some reports as far as 30 kilometers from the crater, directly toward communities that have built their entire lives around learning to live with this mountain's moods. Towns like Panimaché I and Panimaché II, Morelia, Santa Sofía, El Rodeo, Ceylon, and La Rochela are named specifically in INSIVUMEH's own daily reports as places where fine ash is expected to fall, dusting rooftops, water tanks, and crops with the same gray powder that has become a routine, if unwelcome, part of daily life for the people who live there. Picture what an ordinary morning looks like in one of those villages during a stretch like this one. Residents wake to find a fine gray dusting already settled across the roofs and courtyards, the kind of ash that gets into everything, coating leaves and gardens, collecting in the folds of laundry left out overnight, and forcing families to sweep their patios before the day's other chores can even begin. Coffee farmers, and this region grows some of Guatemala's most prized coffee, have to check their crops for ash buildup on the leaves, since a heavy enough coating can interfere with a plant's ability to photosynthesize if it is not washed or brushed away in time. None of this is new to these communities. That, in its own way, is exactly the point. An entire regional economy and way of life has had to adapt itself around a volcano that never fully stops. This next part matters, because a handful of explosions an hour might sound almost background noise ordinary for a volcano this active, until you remember what those explosions actually look like on the ground. INSIVUMEH's reports describe explosions strong enough to generate audible rumbling, shockwaves, and sounds compared to a distant locomotive, loud enough to be heard clearly in towns well outside the immediate danger zone, including Antigua Guatemala itself, the UNESCO World Heritage colonial city, sitting just 16 kilometers from the crater and one of the country's most visited tourist destinations. At night, incandescent pulses of glowing rock are visible rising as much as 300 meters above the crater rim, followed by avalanches of hot volcanic material that tumble down the mountain's ravines, known locally as barrancas, with names like Seca, Taniluya, Ceniza, Las Lahars, Honda, and Trinidad, sometimes reaching all the way down to where vegetation begins. Most people scrolling past headlines about Guatemala's volcanoes are missing why this particular pattern, explosions, ash, incandescent avalanches, repeated day after day, keeps Guatemalan emergency officials from ever fully relaxing, no matter how routine it starts to feel. This is where it becomes dangerous. Fuego's activity does not stay locked at a single, predictable intensity. INSIVUMEH's own bulletins have repeatedly noted periods of increased internal activity, more seismic events tied to magma rising beneath the surface, greater incandescence glowing from the crater, and more frequent, more powerful explosions. Conditions the Institute has explicitly warned could persist for days or even weeks once they begin. Guatemala's Disaster Coordination Agency, known as CONRED, tracks Fuego using a 4-level alert scale, and while the volcano spends most of its time at the lowest active tier, called yellow, It has moved to orange during stronger pulses on repeated occasions in recent years, each time triggering tighter monitoring and, in the most severe cases, precautionary evacuations along the volcano's most exposed flanks. That escalation pattern has repeated itself multiple times, just in the current year alone. Earlier bulletins from INSIVUMEH have specifically flagged stretches where explosion counts climbed above 10 or 12 per hour, where incandescent material was recorded traveling further from the crater than usual, and where officials explicitly warned that conditions could intensify further without additional notice. Each time, Conrad's messaging to the public has followed the same basic template, acknowledging the increase, reminding residents of established evacuation protocols, and stopping short of ordering evacuations outright unless the specific indicators tied to a genuine paroxysmal event begin to appear. That restraint is deliberate. Ordering evacuations too readily risks residents losing trust in future warnings, while waiting too long risks repeating the exact mistake that cost so many lives in 2018. Every bulletin issued during a period of rising activity represents that same difficult balance being weighed in real time. And now it gets worse, because Fuego's history includes a day that Guatemala has never been allowed to forget. On June 3rd, 2018, this same volcano produced the most powerful eruption it had generated since 1974. A sudden, violent paroxysm that sent pyroclastic flows scalding avalanches of gas, ash, and rock moving at hurricane speed, pouring down the Las Lahars drainage on the volcano's eastern side. Those flows filled the ravine faster than anyone anticipated, and eventually overflowed its capacity entirely, surging directly into the nearby communities of San Miguel Los Lotes and El Rodeo, and reaching as far as the La Reunion Golf Resort in Zacatepeques. The town of Los Lotes was buried where it stood. Official counts from Guatemalan authorities eventually placed the confirmed death toll from that single eruption at approximately 200 people, with hundreds more reported missing. Many of their remains never recovered because the volcanic deposits stayed too hot to safely excavate for days afterward, and were simply too deep to fully clear even once they cooled. It remains the deadliest single volcanic event in Guatemala since the 1902 eruption of Santa Maria, and ash from that 2018 disaster reached all the way to Guatemala City, forcing the closure of La Aurora International Airport while military crews worked to clear the runways. The scale of that single day is difficult to overstate. Pyroclastic flows are not slow-moving lava creeping downhill at a pace a person could outwalk. They are superheated mixtures of gas, ash, and rock fragments that can travel at speeds rivaling a highway car, hugging the ground and incinerating almost everything directly in their path within seconds of arrival. Survivors and rescue workers who responded in the days afterward described entire streets in Los Lotes reduced to gray, ash-covered plains, with only the tops of a few structures still visible above the debris. Rescue teams searching the buried town had to work in protective suits against the residual heat, and international search and rescue units, including personnel who had responded to earthquakes and other disasters around the world, described the scene as among the most difficult recovery operations they had ever taken part in. One more thing you need to know about that catastrophe, because it is the exact reason today's monitoring exists in its current form. Survivors and investigators who examined the response afterward found that many residents of Los Lotes received only limited warning before the pyroclastic flow arrived. In a community that sat directly in the path of a drainage system nobody had fully appreciated could overflow that catastrophically, that quickly. In the years since, INSIVUMEH has added seismic stations and gas measurement points, specifically on Fuego's south and southeast flanks, the exact direction those 2018 flows traveled, and Conrad has tightened its evacuation triggers, becoming more willing to order precautionary evacuations on orange alerts in the communities along that same southeast flank, rather than waiting for conditions to escalate further. Las Lahars itself is now treated as a dedicated watch drainage, with special bulletins specifically flagging any sign that pyroclastic material is pushing into its middle or lower sections. Beyond the physical monitoring network, the disaster also reshaped something harder to measure, the culture of caution surrounding this specific mountain. Local tour guides who once led hikers close to the summit now operate under far more conservative rules. Municipal authorities in towns near the southeast flank rehearse evacuation drills that did not exist in the same form before 2018. Even ordinary residents who lost neighbors or relatives in Los Lotes carry a different relationship with the sound of a stronger than usual explosion echoing down from the crater, one shaped by direct personal memory rather than abstract statistics about explosion counts and column heights. That lived memory, as much as any seismometer or gas sensor, is part of what keeps this region alert to a volcano that, on the surface, looks like it is simply doing what it always does. Now the focus shifts to what all of that institutional memory means for the ash drifting over communities right now, this week. Every single daily bulletin INSIVUMEH publishes today carries the direct legacy of 2018 written into its structure, tracking not just how high the ash column rises, but which direction it is moving, how far it is traveling. which specific barrancas are receiving incandescent material, and whether that material is staying contained within the ravines or beginning to spread toward the vegetation line and the communities beyond it. When today's reports describe columns rising to 4,800 meters and drifting west and southwest across a roughly 30-kilometer radius, that level of specificity exists because Guatemalan volcanologists learned, at enormous human cost, exactly how quickly a seemingly routine explosive pattern can shift into something that outruns a community's ability to react. Here's why this is serious beyond the immediate ashfall itself. Guatemala sits squarely within the Central American volcanic arc, a chain of volcanoes formed by the Cocos Plate sliding, or subducting, beneath the Caribbean Plate offshore, a geological process that also powers Fuego's neighboring volcanoes, Pacaya and Santiaguito, both of which INSIVUMEH monitors in the same daily bulletins alongside Fuego itself. This is not a single isolated hazard sitting in one corner of the country. It is one especially active piece of a broader volcanic system that shapes daily life, agriculture, and emergency planning across a significant stretch of Guatemala's highlands. There is another layer to this story that draws in people who have never lived anywhere near Guatemala at all. Fuego sits joined to its neighboring peak, Acatenango, in a combined complex known as La Horqueta, and Acatenango has become one of Central America's most popular overnight trekking destinations, specifically because climbers can camp on its slopes and watch Fuego's explosions light up the night sky from a relatively safe distance. Tour operators running these overnight hikes track the same INSIVUMEH alert levels that Conrad uses, and reputable companies have grown increasingly conservative in recent years about running tours during stronger explosive pulses, even when the official alert level sits at the baseline yellow tier. During a genuine red alert, the kind reserved for paroxysmal events on the scale of 2018, every tour operator's access to the mountain is closed entirely by Conrad, no exceptions, a policy shaped directly by the lessons of that disaster. Think about what that actually means for the people living inside the system day after day. Farmers in communities like Morelia and Santa Sofía have learned to check the wind direction each morning the same way people elsewhere check for rain, because the ash that falls on their crops and water tanks depends entirely on which way Fuego happens to be blowing that day. Families in Panimaché Uno and Panimaché Dos keep evacuation routes memorized, not as an abstract precaution, but as genuinely practiced knowledge, because Conrad's own public guidance explicitly instructs residents near these volcanoes to know their community's evacuation plan, follow local authorities' instructions without hesitation, and self-evacuate immediately if conditions warrant it rather than waiting for an official order that might arrive too late. Masks get used to filter ash from the air. Water containers get covered before a column drifts overhead. Rooftops get swept clean afterward, not for appearance, but because accumulated ash left sitting on a roof can add enough weight to threaten poorly built structures, especially once rain moves in and turns dry, ash heavy and wet. Conrad's guidance goes further still, urging families in these communities to maintain what officials call a family response plan, a documented, rehearsed understanding of exactly where each household member should go and how they should reach safety if conditions deteriorate quickly. The agency has also emphasized the principle of self-evacuation, meaning residents are explicitly encouraged not to wait passively for an official evacuation order before moving to safety if they personally judge conditions to be worsening, a direct lesson drawn from 2018, when some residents in the hardest-hit communities had only minutes, not hours, between the first signs of serious danger and the arrival of pyroclastic material. That shift in guidance, from waiting for official instruction to trusting residents' own judgment about when to move, represents one of the most significant changes in how Guatemala approaches volcanic risks since that disaster. That rain is its own compounding danger that most people outside Guatemala never think to consider. INSIVUMEH's bulletins have specifically warned about the elevated risk of lahars during the country's rainy season, destructive mudflows that form when loose volcanic ash and debris sitting on Fuego's slopes mix suddenly with heavy rainfall, then surge downhill with enough force to carry boulders a meter or more across and uproot trees in their path. A lahar does not require a fresh eruption to occur. It only requires enough loose ash already sitting on the mountain and enough rain falling hard enough to mobilize it, conditions that align with troubling regularity during Guatemala's wet months, precisely the stretch of the calendar this current activity is unfolding within. INSIVUMEH's own reports document these events happening in real time. Past bulletins have described lahars descending the ceniza drainage carrying tree branches, trunks, and boulders ranging from 30 centimeters to as much as 3 meters in diameter, moving with enough force to reshape the stream bed itself within minutes. A lahar can travel with almost no warning beyond the sound of rushing water and grinding rock suddenly building in volume, which is exactly why INSIVUMEH's standing recommendation is simple and unambiguous. Avoid being in or near the ravines during rainfall on the volcano at all, regardless of how calm the explosive activity itself might look on a given day. Roads that cross these drainages, including sections that connect small farming communities to larger towns, are sometimes closed preemptively during heavy rain, specifically because of this risk, an inconvenience that residents have learned to accept as simply part of living on this mountain's slopes. This is where it becomes dangerous in a way that outlasts the eruption itself. A community that has already dealt with weeks of ashfall settling across its rooftops and hillsides is sitting on exactly the kind of loose material a sudden downpour can turn into a fast-moving hazard with very little additional warning. INSIVUMEH's recommendations to avoid ravines during periods of rainfall on the volcano exist specifically because of this compounding risk, and they are reissued bulletin after bulletin precisely because the danger does not go away simply because the explosive activity itself looks routine on any given day. Most people are missing just how sophisticated Guatemala's monitoring of this single mountain has become as a direct result of its violent history. A network of webcams managed by INSIVUMEH watches Fuego and its neighboring volcano Santiaguito around the clock, updating images every minute so that explosions, lava flows, gas dispersal, and ash movement can all be tracked continuously rather than only when someone happens to be looking. Seismic and acoustic sensors feed data directly to INSIVUMEH's central offices in Guatemala City, giving technical staff a real-time picture of what is happening beneath the surface, even when clouds or darkness obscure the summit itself from camera view. That data feeds directly into Conrad's alert system, and Conrad in turn coordinates with the Washington VAAC on aviation ash advisories, ensuring that a hazard capable of grounding flights at La Aurora International Airport, the way it did in 2018, gets flagged to pilots and airlines long before an aircraft ever gets close enough to matter. This layered system, cameras, seismic sensors, acoustic monitors, gas measurement stations, all feeding into a central technical office that then coordinates with a separate emergency management agency, exists because Guatemala learned the hard way that a single point of failure in that chain can cost lives. INSIVUMEH's public messaging is explicit on this point, warning that any analysis of the volcano's activity not produced by its own trained volcanology staff carries no official weight and requires validation before the public should act on it, a direct response to the kind of unverified rumors and social media speculation that can spread faster than accurate information during a genuine emergency. The Institute publishes daily bulletins, special reports during periods of heightened activity, and technical assessments specifically so that residents, journalists, and international observers all have one clear, authoritative source to check rather than piecing together fragments from unofficial channels. One more thing worth remembering before we close this out. Fuego has been a documented active threat since Spanish colonial records began tracking it in 1524, with at least 55 historically documented eruptions recorded since then, an average of one significant eruptive episode roughly every 9 years across 5 centuries, and a modern eruptive phase that has now been running essentially without pause since 2002. That is the context surrounding every single bulletin issued about this week's ash plume drifting southwest over Guatemalan communities. It is not a volcano behaving strangely. It is a volcano behaving exactly the way it has behaved for as long as anyone has kept written records of it, which is precisely why Guatemalan authorities never allow that familiarity to soften into complacency. The next stretch of days will look, on paper, much like the ones before it. INSIVUMEH will publish another daily bulletin tomorrow morning, listing how many explosions occurred overnight, how high the ash columns rose, and which direction the wind carried them. Conrad will repeat its now familiar guidance to residents near the volcano: know your evacuation route, keep a family response plan ready, cover your water before ash falls, and clean your roof after it does. Farmers in Morelia and Santa Sofía will check the wind again in the morning the way they have every morning this year. And that, in the end, is the real weight of this story. Fuego is not a mountain building toward some single identifiable moment the way a storm builds toward landfall or a hurricane builds toward a coastline. It is a mountain that has simply never fully stopped, for more than 2 decades running, forcing an entire region to build its ordinary, everyday life around a hazard that most of the world only hears about when something goes catastrophically wrong, the way it did in 2018. The communities living on these slopes are not waiting for an eruption. They are living inside one, continuously, and the daily bulletins, the evacuation drills, the swept rooftops, and the covered water tanks are simply what it looks like to keep functioning underneath a volcano that was never going to give anyone the luxury of a clean, predictable finish. Somewhere on the slopes above those same farming communities, a mountain that has never fully stopped erupting since before some of those same farmers were even born will keep sending glowing pulses into the night sky, keep triggering avalanches down barrancas whose names are known by heart in every nearby village, and keep reminding a country that already paid an unbearable price in 2018 that this particular volcano has never actually promised anyone that today will stay routine.